welcome. This is part 5 of our anti-bias and anti-racist theories alongside PEACH, which we've had a pleasure of working with and collaborating with since May of last year nearly. So in this series that started in August, we've been working on several different topics, including today's topic, which is part 5, anti-racist strategies to prevent suspensions and expulsions in ECE. And so our presenters today will be myself, LaTanya Hardy, Michelle Dejournay, and Tony Isaacs. And we also have our presenters for next week's Spanish workshop here with us today as well. Okay, and so in our focus today, we're going to discuss what we can do as early educators to mitigate our biases when supporting the behavior of children of color, particularly in preventing suspensions and expulsions, as they're largely an adult situation. And we'll cover some content, practice, and role-playing, and have a brief discussion around these topics. PEACH. PEACH is this partnership for education, articulation, and coordination for higher ed. And basically, it's a group of higher ed systems that include partner teachers from other ECE and child development programs for different universities and allied professional development programs. And basically, it's a group of early learning professionals who, from different schools and PD programs that focus on these 3 goals. So number 1, they focus on transforming educational readiness to strengthen the early childhood workforce, including yourself. Number 2, they identify and influence what makes a good, like a high quality early childhood education degrees, certificates, credentials, etc. And priority number 3, they focus on influencing accessible and equitable early childhood higher education pathways for all students. So all of you and all of ourselves can access higher education and keep providing high quality and high caliber learning experiences and programs for young learners. We have LaTanya Hardy and we have Michelle Dejournay. LaTanya, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, everyone. Excuse me. My name is LaTanya Hardy, and I'm the current director of LA Trade Tech College Child Development Center.
Wonderful. Okay, and Michelle?
Hi, I'm Michelle Dejournay, and I am an assistant professor of anti-racism and equity in early childhood studies at Cal Poly Pomona.
Marvelous. Thank you. And myself, I am Christina Espinosa, the Family Education Coordinator with QSLA, where I offer professional development opportunities like these. And I have the great pleasure of working with you all to support families' well-being and resilience. Go ahead, Tony.
Hi, everybody. Happy evening. I'm Tony Isaacs. Previously, the program coordinator of PEACH. I'm adjunct faculty at Moore Park College, and I'm currently now the UPK coordinator at Ventura County Office of Ed. So happy to be here with y'all.
Okay, so our objectives, we're going to focus on these 3 key objectives. We're going to discuss the data on preschool suspensions and expulsions and their effects on children of color. We're also going to discuss what are the different factors that lead to inequities and how discipline is applied to children in pre-K and not so much kindergarten, but more so pre-K. We're also going to discuss what strategies, after all this background information, what strategies can we bring into our early learning programs to assess and adjust our discipline practices with anti-racism and equity and inclusion principles in mind. And here's our agenda, very similar to the objectives. We're actually going to kick it off with the role-playing scenario right now. So just keep that in mind. This is an interactive workshop. We want to hear your voices. We're going to ask questions. We have some polls, and we'll have some spaces where you can share in the chat as well, and on occasion on the mic. We're also going to be discussing the data, as I mentioned. Then we'll discuss mindset shifts, and lastly, strategies to address the factors that impact suspensions and expulsions. And then we'll wrap it up with a 2-question discussion panel in breakout rooms and a usual resource overview and closing. So we're going to move into suspensions and expulsions in early learning, the data and trends. And Michelle, if you want to take it on over.
Hello, everyone. So we're going to talk about, like Christina said, Jan beat us to the punch. Got to talk about we gotta talk about what the research says, right? About what's going on in this space. I am a professor in early childhood studies at Cal Poly Pomona, and my research focuses on this very topic in terms of over-disciplining children of color, Black children in preschool specifically, in early childhood spaces. And so I've done a lot of research and a lot of presentations on this topic, and I want to share some of that with you tonight. So right now we are going to watch a video by Dr. Rosemarie Allen. Is someone who I have cited many times in my work. She does fantastic work in this space and is a fantastic teacher of other early childhood educators. And really looking at discipline in general of Black children and us taking ownership of that, right, of our actions and what causes those actions. That this is adult behavior. And so, yeah, we'll watch this video, and then, as Christina said, we'd like to hear your thoughts and in the chat.
Young children are being suspended and expelled from school at alarming rates. Preschool children are suspended 3 times more than kindergarten through 12th grades combined. In Illinois, 40% of child care centers reported suspending infants and toddlers. Yes, those are children who have not yet turned 3 years old. African-American children are only 19% of the preschool population, but comprise nearly half of all suspensions. You may be wondering, what can these kids possibly be doing to be suspended and kicked out of school so young? Surprisingly, many of them are engaging in typical childlike behaviors. I was one of those children. From the time I entered school, I was suspended at least 7 times a year. I was suspended for things like digging a hole in the playground to see if China was really on the other side of the earth. For that, I was labeled destructive. After a unit on maps, I climbed on top of the school auditorium so I could get a bird's eye view. And after the fire department and the police department got me down, I was suspended. And for that, I was labeled incorrigible. There was this one time I took all the baby dolls' heads, arms, and legs off. I just wanted to see how the body parts fit together. But for that, I was labeled a demon. They actually told my parents I exhibited demon-like behaviors. Then there was this one time I snuck into the boys' bathroom. I wanted to see how they got to pee standing up. And for that, I was labeled sexually perverted. Now, these are all childlike behaviors, albeit from a very curious child, but childlike nonetheless. Let's look at behaviors. What is it that children do when they get upset or they're deemed out of control? They scream, cry, hit, cuss, fight, throw things. That's because they're kids. Kids are going to be kids. They don't have the capacity to handle such intense emotions. Let's take a look at what adults do when they get upset. Kick, scream, cry, fight, cuss, throw things. The list is exactly the same. And while we can expect kids to be kids, as adults, what's our excuse? My friend Walter Gilliam says, suspensions are adult decisions. Suspensions are adult behaviors. But what if we change that behavior? What if we shift our thinking, focusing on the behavior of adults rather than focusing on the behavior of
That question, what if we shift our focus from the behavior of the child to the behavior of the educator? What do you think about that? In the next 30 seconds, throw it in the chat, please. Such a powerful shift. Let's focus on us. Yeah, it's usually training of the adults and not the children that's needed, and children copy what they see. Training and retraining. It's very interesting points. To be honest, I don't know how much training you can give someone to combat their own bias. We try, you know, but it's really internal work that needs to be done, right? And it's really about reflective practice. It's really about looking at what are we doing as teachers, and are we connecting with children, or are we just punishing children? What I've come to learn, and you'll see, is what, I'm sorry, I think I'm on, here we go. What I've come to learn is that we have forgotten the definition of discipline. And we've conflated the definition, we've conflated discipline with punishment, right? Discipline means to teach, to guide, to nurture. And as Dr. Allen said, they're children, right? They're still learning how to be. We're talking about suspending children who have been on earth for 36 months. Think about that, right? And then really the data shows that white children who are over 40% of the preschool population, but only 28% of those who are suspended one or more times. Conversely, Black students are less than 20% of the population, but almost half of the suspensions. That's what we call disproportionate, right? And so we really got to think about why this is happening. Are we teaching children? In the situations that Dr. Allen shared with us, reason why she was punished for these behaviors, she was punished for her developmentally appropriate childlike curiosity, right? For her wanting to find answers to the questions. She was punished rather than someone helping her find answers to the questions, right? So the data shows, Dr. Allen cited Dr. Gilliam's work that really shows that Black preschoolers in state-funded programs are suspended, are expelled or suspended at about twice the rate of Latinx students, 6 times the rate of white children, and nearly 20 times as likely to be expelled as Asian American children. In my research, I found the exact same thing. I interviewed preschool teachers about their beliefs about discipline in early childhood pre-K classrooms, and my research showed a lot of the same results as Dr. Gilliam did. We've also found in the research what is called soft discipline. So many early childhood programs will tell us that they don't suspend or they don't expel students. They don't expel children, right? But they will tell a parent, this might not be the right program for your child. You've expelled them, right? If you've said, we need you to come pick up your child because of a behavior, maybe a child bit another child. Again, developmentally appropriate behavior that many toddlers do. And if the parent has been called and said, come get your child that child has been suspended for the day. If the child has asked to find a new program, that child has been expelled. Maybe the child has been told that they have to leave the classroom, but they have to sit in the director's office for the day. Or that child is told they need a timeout, right? They're denied playing outside. They're told they can't participate in a field trip or those types of things. These are exclusionary discipline practice, right? And so might not seem as harsh as, you've been suspended or you've been expelled, but if you are excluding a child from their peer environment, then that is an exclusionary discipline practice. So what are some of the results of this, right? We have children with low self-esteem. We have children who have a lack of sense of belonging in school. They have a negative self-perception. What's wrong with me? What did I do wrong? How come the teacher doesn't like me, right? So then they disengage from learning. They disengage from school. They disengage from socializing with their peers. And they start to believe that they don't belong in school. School isn't for me. I keep getting kicked out. I must not belong here. Again, more harmful side effects of this, oftentimes children of color, especially Black boys, are given an assumption of criminality. And this excessive discipline, especially exclusionary discipline, Dr. Allen shared that she was suspended from school over and over and over again, right? And what happens is that children lose vital education time. Research shows that children who are expelled in early childhood often have recurring expulsions throughout their educational trajectory. Many times they drop out of school. Like we said, they get that a lack of sense of belonging. They feel like they don't belong in school. They keep getting in trouble. So why do I go back, right? And then they end up dropping out of school, oftentimes getting into criminal behavior, ending up in the criminal justice system, and it sets them down, a discouraging path. Also, suspension and expulsion also lead to a harmful disconnect, between the education environment and schools, right? And this is what we call the preschool to prison pipeline, right? When children are expelled over and over and over, and then as they get older, they decide that school isn't for them, right? I want to very briefly share about how our work really mirrors our society, right? Oftentimes, Dr. Gilliam talks about the three biggest reasons why, or indicators for young boys being suspended from school. If he's big, he's Black, and a boy. Big Black boy. So that means maybe a child is taller than his peers, right? He's perceived to be a threat. And our society historically has felt threatened by Black males, right? Even if they're little Black males. Just last week, a white man in Kansas City, Missouri, shot a 16-year-old Black boy who rang his doorbell, and shot him again. He was taken in for questioning and let go, right? This 16-year-old boy rang his doorbell. He was at the wrong door. He rang his doorbell. The man shot him in the head. And you might ask, Dr. Dejournette, why are you talking about this? My point is that, like I said, we have assumptions of criminality. Dr. Gilliam's work shows that when we're looking for criminal behavior might seem like a big word when we're talking about preschoolers, right? But when we expect children to misbehave, we assume these children to be troublemakers, to be up to no good, strictly by their appearance. This teenager rang this man's doorbell and he shot him. And what he said was, a 6-foot Black man was at my door and I was, and I quote, scared to death. So he shot him. We often perceive Black children to be bigger and scarier than they are. This was not a 6-foot Black man. This was a 5'8", 16-year-old boy. And his only crime was he rang his doorbell. As a society, we are afraid of Black males. And when we often have, when we see this in our society, that's what informs our bias. And we often project that bias on even our youngest Black males, unfortunately.
I have you go ahead to the next slide and press our video. We're going to start there. Thank you.
There's a new study out of the Yale Child Study Center that I had to read a few times just to believe what it was telling me. The researchers recruited about 135 preschool teachers. They had them watch video footage of 4 kids playing, a Black boy, a Black girl, a white boy, and a white girl. And they told the teachers, their subjects, watch the video, there may be some challenging behaviors. As soon as you see something that could become challenging, hit the enter key on your keypad. And here's the trick. There was no challenging behavior. The researchers were using eye scan technology to see which child the teachers were looking at the most. And what they found is that the teachers, both white and Black alike, spent the most time watching the Black boy, waiting for bad behavior. It never came. There's one more really interesting headline in the study, which comes later. The teachers were also given a 1-paragraph description to read of a hypothetical child with a stereotypical name who behaves pretty badly in class, pushes, scratches, throws toys. And some of the teachers were also given some biographical information that helped make sense of that behavior. They were told that the child lives with his mother, father has been in and out for years, they're relatively poor, the mother is depressed, works 3 jobs. Researchers wanted to know if knowing this information made the teachers more empathetic to the kid. Well, here's the shock. It did, but only if the teacher and the child were of the same race. If the teacher and the child, a white teacher and a Black child, or even a Black teacher and a white child, knowing that biographical information, those teachers were less empathetic towards those students. And here's why this matters. Imagine if this is true, if there's this empathy deficit in preschool, well, imagine where else it's true.
That's a, excuse me, a great video. And here's one of the reasons why I enjoy it, and I often show that in my classes, because I talk to pre-service educators that they are gatekeepers. So as educators and unintentional gatekeepers, that's what we are.
Sorry.
Due to our positions of power. So as an educator, you have a position of power. And we need to ask ourselves the impactful question, and then questions, and be reflective and be able to stand in our truth. Because if you notice in the video, it talked about how everyone looked at the African-American child. So it goes back to systemic racism or systemic biases, right? When disciplinary decisions are being made, who has a voice and who's been left out? Are families involved in the design of disciplinary practices in your program? And who determines what disciplinary practices are fair and unfair? Who's being served by that? Next slide. Oh, perfect, right now. Moving beyond the school doors into our moral terrain. Our moral outrage should propel us toward a society that rests in social justice, a society that protects all children, right? Because we've all been, or many of us have been to NAAC or read items from NAAC or been to the doctor and they say, do no harm, right? NAAC Code of Ethics, do no harm, right? So we have to look deeper at our beliefs, our policies in our program, our procedures, and our practices. Are we harming children? And how do we know who matters, right? Everyone's talking about who matters. But how do we know who matters? When we look around the room, is it in our textbooks, in the books? Is it in the languages that are spoken? Is it the suspension rate, right? Is it that who's in front of us in the classroom? So educators must consider their actions or lack of action when serving students. Educators need to look at our practices and our policies that are need to build a foundation for a socially just education for all learners, and especially our Black and Brown learners who are racially picked on, racially experiencing bias, and we are harming. When you just look at the numbers, that we are harming, right? This proportion, that Dr. Michelle had pointed out the numbers and the number of that are suspended. We have to look at those numbers, right? The numbers, how people say the numbers don't lie. A socially just education is about what we do, not solely our intentions, because everybody, we have good intentions, right? But really putting into action those beliefs and practices that support children, especially our Black and Brown children. Because they say if you do it for the least of them, then everyone benefits, right? Next slide. So what factors lead to inequities? So our unconscious bias in ourselves. So we as educators have to look at our biases. We have to overhaul our way of thinking and look at our biases that have plagued our educational practices. Implicit bias refers to unconscious attitudes, reactions, stereotypes, and categories that affect behavior and understanding. We have to look at the preschool to prison pipeline. When I was elementary school teacher, I think back to many, many moons ago, dating myself, an elementary school teacher at Armenta in North Hollywood. We had a very strict principal. And as a new teacher, I'll tell you some of the mistakes I made. One of the number one mistake I remember is being a new teacher and so excited about having my classroom that I wore heels the first day. Who does that? Who does that? Who wears heels the first day? My feet were killing me with the first day. But the other thing that this was really pronounced at this school is that when we walked in a line, everyone had to be quiet with their hands behind their back. When we walked to the library, quiet classroom with your hands behind your back. And if your class was a little just talking, if they didn't have their hands behind their back, the principal was all over you. And think about that. So what were we teaching? What was that process about? What were we setting children up for, right? So teacher stress and wellness. You know, I'm talking about some of the challenges, but I understand that teachers have a lot of stress, right? You do a hard job, many educators. We do a hard job and it's not an easy job. And we are trying to create the best for children and ourselves. And it starts with us taking those hard looks at ourselves. So one of the challenges is lack of behavioral support, resources, and expertise. Not having those items in place or those people in place to help and support children, and especially children of color. Next slide, please. Unconscious bias in ourselves as educators, school discipline, and incarceration data have long shown that Black and Hispanic students experience suspension and expulsion at a much higher rate than white students. And that as adults, they are disproportionately represented in our country's prison system. We have to move past the deficit thinking example. And so an example of that, what's deficit thinking, you might ask? So for example, this, if you've heard, well, if Black parents cared more about education, their children would do better. This kind of thinking, this thinking downplays systemic racism, right? It downplays the systemic racism that is inbred in the air that we breathe, that we don't even know that it's going on. Many of us, but some of us are waking up, right? Deficit bias thinking. Next slide, please. Educators, family relationships, right? Building trust. We've spoken in the previous breakout room about talking to a fellow educator about a child that we thought that they were being a little harsh on, right? And then when you have those brave conversations, it has to come from a place of trust. So if I don't trust, say, Christina, and she's telling me something that I think is wrong, I'm gonna, that's just Christina. She doesn't know. Or I don't, I won't take what she has to heart, right? So when we're working with families, it's about building that relationship. It's about building that trust. It's about that I know you all know of, when we're having to have some of those harsh conversations or tough conversations, that we go back to that hamburger method, right? We start with something positive about the kid. And some people say, well, there's nothing positive about this kid. There has to be, right? Because if it's not, then we're in the wrong field. So if it's not, then we're in the wrong field. We have to find something positive about the child, right? And so you start off with the positive, right? You have the issues. I think we were talking about the child biting, right? Before. And then you go back into the end, the child biting, this has been an issue. And then you end with that positive. How are we going to work on this biting together? Parent, you come up with those solutions that you and the parent are working together for the biting or the scratching or the hitting or the whatever. But building that trust relationship, connect rather than condescend, and challenge the deficit thinking. Get to know the community that you serve, right? Who's in that community? Who's in that family? What do their family consist of? That's one of the reasons what about Head Start that I love home visits, because you get to go into someone's home environment and get to know children and families on a deeper level. And we have to put parents in the driver's seat in a way that's not threatening, because they're with their children, right? They have those children. Those are their children. And although we might have them for 8 hours, 9 hours, or maybe even 10 hours a day, those are their children. And we have to respect that they want the best for their children. And we have to respect that we, as teachers or as educators, can't feel that we can override what that parent has, desires for their kid. We can supplement, we can make recommendations, but at the end of the day, we're not the parents, right? So it's about working together and building that relationship. Next slide, please. Teachers, stress and wellness. Being a teacher is not for the weak. I think I've said it before. And I know you're strong educators because you're sitting here, hearing these hard conversations, taking an additional workshop, right? Where you could be somewhere else on a Tuesday night watching some show, right? Not watching Netflix, but learning to perfect your career, the business that you're in. I always admire people that go back and take classes in a field that they're in because they want to do better. And it's so important for educators to do this, right? Because so they can get better. But I know our job is hard. It's not easy being an educator. And so one of the things with being an educator, we have to go back to, when you fly on a plane, right? And the pilot says to put the oxygen over yourself, right? So that you can save, the children next to you or your child next to you. And sometimes as educators, we give and we give and we give and we give. And I want you to take some time to reflect, but also some time for some self-care and some self-knowledge, right? And some time to reflect on what's best practices for children, right? And what can we do to provide care for children who are routinely being discriminated, being exposed being, God forbid, I hear this again, children being put in timeout, excluded from school, right? So teacher stress and wellness is very important. So when all of this, although we're learning lots, it's really important that you take care of yourself. We've got to look at teacher stress level, and we've got to move away from the Eurocentric point of view. A Eurocentric point of view is looking at everything that's, oh, well, we've been doing it this way, right? We've been doing things this way for years, right? Moving away from the Caucasian, that this is the way it is. This is the way it's been done, right? I think of when we think of just the story of the Native Americans, and people where we were taught things about Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492. And how do you say someone discovered something where someone already was there? And we just got to move away to that old way of teaching, that old way, and move into new ways of teaching, learning, and being and serving children. Next slide, please. Lack of behavior support and resources and experience. So teachers need, and school programs need, additional resource. Exclusionary discipline is more likely within programs that lack the resources needed. For example, behavior specialists, early childhood mental health consultants, assistants in the classroom, right? To develop the interventions and provide support for children with challenging behaviors, we need those resources in place. And teachers and providers often lack the space, the support, and or training and time to reflect on their practice to identify how they might be causing harm. Remember, we got to sit in it. We got to think about it. How is my practices causing harm? And then when we sit in it, we've got to consider, how are we going to change it? Because knowing the problem and not changing it is, that doesn't work. That doesn't serve children. And for most of us, that's not why we got into the field of education, right? We all got in the field, most, I can't say speak for everybody, but we got in the field of education to make a difference. We got into the field of education to do better for children, right? And so that takes us to looking at ourselves, seeing what resources that we need, seeing what resources that we have, and seeing how we can better serve children. We have to get away from low expectations for children. And the number of children that are routinely referred to special ed and not often referred to the gifted programs. So when you're looking at your program and you're self-reflecting on your program, you look around, how many children are being referred to for special needs? What ethnicity are they? What gender are they? How many children are being referred to for the gifted programs? Something to think about. Next slide, please. Our mindset challenge. So we need to challenge our Eurocentric narrative and take that reflective walk. Who is being dehumanized within our education? Who's being valued? And how do you know? When you look around your room, what do you see? When you look around your school, who's being omitted? Who's being excluded, right? A mindful shift from a culture of denial to one in which we are comfortable questioning what constitutes normalcy. We have to think about the children, right? So there's always something that we can do in this world. As educators, it's so important, our role. And I think when I did the short video for QSLA, I said, when we know better, we do better, right? So the part about knowing better. So now we're taking things in tonight, and hopefully we're learning more to do better, to take that look outside of us and our program to what's best for children. And so when we know better, right, we're going to do better, right? Next slide, please.
Okay, thank you so much, Latanya. Now we're going to take it over to Tony. Go ahead.
So thank you, Christina. So we've heard from Michelle about the unjust practices of exclusion and suspension and how they disproportionately impact children of color, and from Latanya about some factors that contribute to these high levels of suspension and expulsion and really unjust disciplinary practices. So now I'm going to focus on some very practical strategies that you as an early educator can do as soon as tomorrow to address these factors. So if you go to the next slide, please. So first of all, as Latanya had talked about, addressing the lack of support, resources and expertise, it is critical that we have the support and resources that we need to engage in ongoing professional development, especially related to positive behavioral supports, as well as anti-racism, equity, exclusion, and diversity. So this is an important first step that you can take. So one of the resources that just came out maybe a little over a month ago, and it's in our Padlet. It's the Creating Equitable Early Learning Environments for Young Boys of Color, Disrupting Disproportionate Outcomes. And this is a wonderful document. I think it's about 600 pages. It has lots of research, best practices, and lots of questions for reflection. And this would be a really great publication that you can use as an anchoring document for your staff meetings, for communities of practice, or just for your own self-reflection. I also encourage you to explore the previous webinars and articles from this anti-racism series so that you can revisit, oftentimes, we may have heard the information once, but hearing it a second time, we pick up on something new. And then also take advantage of development opportunities. CPIN has lots of wonderful resources and trainings, as well as the ECE registry, and SECO also has some great training. So it's, keep building your skills when it comes to anti-racism. Reflect on your classroom practices. I think it came out a couple times in some of the discussion groups, videotape yourself. See if you're treating children differently in your classroom. Are we being more impatient with our children of color? And then use that as a point for us to meet with either our supervisor, a mentor, a coach, or a colleague to really think about how we could change our practices. Also, another great opportunity is to subscribe to websites that provide free teacher resources, such as Learning for Justice or Teaching for Change. And those are all in the Padlet, I believe. And then also identify community partners, such as your local resource center or healthcare agencies who can help provide those targeted support that your staff may need. So the next slide. So then the other thing we want to think about is how we can address our stress, because we know that stress often leads us to be impatient with children, and that could be a reason why we also tend to be treating some children differently. Maybe they're pushing our buttons. Sometimes it's unintentional or unconscious, but thinking about how we could relieve stress. So some of the things we can do are like integrating physical activity into our daily routines, such as going on a nature walk, practicing yoga, playing tag. Not only is that a great stress reliever for us as a teacher, but it's great for children to relieve their stress and they have fun doing it, right? Think about how we could incorporate creative outlets. If you love cooking, do cooking in your class. If you love to dance, incorporate dance in your class. Practice, daily affirmations. How wonderful it will be, catching a child being good, especially if you find that you tend to be targeting certain children instead of saying the no or stop, because that was one of the questions group I was in, right? How lovely would it be if instead we're catching children being good and we're sending a note home? I've had parents who say, oh my gosh, no one's ever called me to say my child's been good. The minute you called me, I thought, my child was going to be in trouble. I had one child who had already been kicked out of 4 schools. And to have that teacher call and say, hey, your child had a really great day. Let me tell you what happened. That's so important. And then, of course, engaging in mindfulness practices or taking a break. If you're feeling stressed out, it's okay for you to say, hey, I need to take a break. I need to step away from this situation so that we're not, especially if we're feeling tension between ourselves and a child, move away from that situation. Okay, and then when we think about strengthening our family relationships, I know LaTanya talked a lot about this. So of course, we want to try to connect with our families, both formally and informally. So, at the beginning of the year, how are we setting the environment so that the families know that they're welcomed, that they are seen in the classroom, they're represented. We have, books and materials in our classroom that represent all the children in our family. We're encouraging families' participation, and especially the participation of fathers. Oftentimes, fathers get left out, even if it's like a parent-teacher conference, the teacher's talking directly to the mother, right? How are we really engaging fathers? And then acknowledging that all families want what's best for their children. I think Christina talked about this, right? So really thinking about all parents want what's best for their children, and they're doing the best they can. And oftentimes there's stressful situations. And so I think if we see them as an ally and really saying we're all here to work together rather than it being an us or them, I think that's really important. And, as well as learning more about, anti-racism, let's learn more about family engagement. So CDE also has a really good publication, Family Partnerships and Culture, so that we can really think about true, authentic family engagement. That's also really important. And then on the next slide, we have this lovely graphic thinking about, when we think about families, let's look at families in a positive way. So rather looking at them in a deficit or thinking like, well, why aren't these parents responding when I say their child's biting and or thinking that the parents don't care? Let's think about what families are bringing. And this is a really nice way of looking at the cultural capital that families bring. So the aspirational capital is that, all families have hopes and dreams for their child. And so if we keep that in the forefront of our mind, instead of getting frustrated, if we acknowledge they may do it differently than I do it as a teacher, but it's because they want what's best for their child, right? They also have linguistic capital, especially when we think about our dual language learners, or their familial capital about, the extended families and how we support the extended family, and how lovely it is that, we've got multiple generations living in a family oftentimes, and how can we make everyone who's in that home feeling that they're welcome and part of that classroom environment. And then, of course, thinking about the social capital, the connections that they have and their networks they have, as well as navigational capital, being able to navigate, institutions such as education that often in their own experience as a parent, maybe they also experienced being suspended or experienced bias, and having to really be able to trust putting their child into that situation, as well as resistance capital, right? We know that a lot of, Michelle, I know, talked beautifully about this. A lot of families of color are experiencing, bias and institutional racism from multiple institutions, not just education, but, housing and all of those different factors that really weigh heavily on families. So those are things that we want to think about, how even with all of that prejudice and bias, that there's that resilience, and the beauty of the resilience and the joy of those families. And so then the last slide that I'm going to talk about is kind of shifting the paradigm. And I know LaTanya also talked about that. So really, we want to make sure that we stop blaming children or families. And we really want to think about there's often unequal educational outcomes as well as exclusionary practices. If we think about even the language we use around the achievement gap, right? That's like blaming the child because they're not at the same level as the other children, rather than thinking of it as the opportunity gap that, you know, families of color and children of color often don't have the same resources or don't have the same opportunities as white children. And so how are we thinking about not blaming the child, but looking at the system and how we could change the system? When we blame the child or the family, that really causes harm to the children and the families and the communities. And so we need to really stop that blame and thinking about how we can be part of the solution to change the systems. And then we want to embrace strength-based views. I think we've talked about this quite a bit today. And then really don't stand by silently. Let's be advocates for change. And kind of bringing it back to Dr. Rosemary Allen, the video that we saw today, I just love this quote from her. It is our responsibility to find and look for what's good, right, and best in every single child. And I hope as you leave today and you walk into your classroom tomorrow, that you are looking for what's good, right, and best for every single child in your classroom.
We want to just touch base on what's being covered there. So Dolly, if you could share the Padlet link one more time in the chat. And this Padlet link has, like I mentioned, the responses to your discussion questions right now and the resources that I'm about to highlight again. Like I mentioned, this super valuable PDF book released by CDE. It has a lot of statistics and tangible practices and reflective questions, as Tony and I believe Latanya mentioned, and Michelle as well. Reflective practice is fundamental to implementing anti-racist education. It helps us connect with what we are doing well and what we need to strengthen and fix. And we also have resources from the California Teaching Pyramid that's more so focused on supporting positive behavior. Go ahead and check that out. And then, like I said, book lists from social justice books. We also I want to highlight, they have a book list specifically for conflict resolution and a book list for teachers on becoming an anti-bias teacher. So super priceless book list. And then our book list, which is right here on screen. I'm just really happy with how these come out. So I want to highlight those to you. And of course, the Funds of Knowledge Toolkit, so we can recognize and incorporate the family capital that we see in our program. Yes. So please go ahead and check out that Padlet.